And then I felt like my sense of credibility had to trump that I showed up as female and as Black. And I mean, to this day, like even just saying that, I feel a bit embarrassed that that's the way that I thought. But I saw, in order to navigate and to move beyond survival and to navigate these spaces, those things mattered to people. Because I saw people relax when I said I was from Seattle.
Oh, yeah.
And I wasn't from Brooklyn, right?
This is Innovation Currency. My name is Leigh-Ann Buchanan, and I am your host. What I want this podcast to help people see about themselves is that innovation is for everyone, and everyone is an innovator. I developed a simple test, a quiz, if you will, to help anyone discover their hidden innovation traits from across 4 specific domains: disruptor, connector, distributor, and influencer. If you haven't already taken the quiz, please stop, take a pause, and go by visiting my website, www.leannbuchanan.com/innovator quiz. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to just get into a very fun, I don't know where it's going to go, conversation today, but it's definitely going to be intentional and thoughtful and deep. And so what I ask is for you to be open, be vulnerable, if you can, and be yourself. So why don't we just start off with you, Sherrell. If you can just do a quick, and you don't worry about the cameras, they're just here to watch us. But if you could just start off by introducing yourself by sharing, how is it you wish to present yourself to the world? Like if you had to, kind of like the Clubhouse bio, like how do you wish to present yourself to the world?
Absolutely. So again, Sherrell Dorsey, as you know, and I think, usually my Twitter bio and my Clubhouse bio talk about me being a data journalist and running The Plug, which is a subscription-based, news platform covering the Black innovation economy. But how I like to show up in the world is as a lifelong learner, and just someone who is always curious, always exploring, always down for the adventure of learning about people, places, and ideas for the most part. I think that's driven most of my life and has helped me to get to where I am now and dictates a lot of where I see myself going.
Excellent. Riyaad.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. So I think I oscillate, right? So sometimes I think I'm an entrepreneur. So my background is in software, starting companies, computer science. And then occasionally I sort of dabble with trying to change the world in small ways, right? So I think that for me, it's kind of being able to change the world in small ways and to be sort of good at being an entrepreneur.
It's interesting, when I think about the term entrepreneur, I often have struggled with it, which is why this book is actually more about innovators. And we've talked about this a lot, Riyaad, right. Which is entrepreneurship can sometimes be so alienating in the sense that a lot of people equate it exclusively with starting a business, which is what it is. But then sometimes it doesn't allow us to tap into our own innovation potential to do things that are different, that have nothing to do with starting a business. So I guess where that leads me for the next question is what we're here to talk about, innovators. And so I'd love to ask you, Sherrell, how do you define innovator? Like, how do you wrap that up in a definition? And then the follow-up is, are you an innovator?
I love that question because it has become jargon in so many ways as this world of startups in Silicon Valley and venture capital have proliferated. And we've all kind of watched this archetype of what an innovator looks like. And when I think about where I'm from and I think about where the kind of community I grew up in, I know folks who never stepped foot in Silicon Valley probably have no idea what it is that I'm talking about, right? Even when I mention a location, I always considered them to be innovators, primarily being able to take existing things or ideas and applying this lens of creativity to see the world differently, or being able to see what's possible and then going about or having the audacity or the moxie to be able to then bring that idea to life, or to change a system, or change a tool so that it helps create efficiencies or create opportunities. And so I would consider myself to be an innovator as well. And I think aside from starting a business, even from looking at, or being an early age and finding different ways to sort of hack toys and things like that, I think just applying that lens of what is possible is what really grounds this idea of innovation.
And Riyaad, and we talk a lot about definitions in our conversations.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've thought about this, but then how do you define the term innovator?
So, being the analytical nerd that I am, the Latin phrase, right? Inno novus, literally into new. One of the things I like to do is understand where we get phrases from and how we use them in the world. And I agree with you. The meaning has been watered down. But what's so interesting is everywhere in the world, like where I'm from the Caribbean. I grew up in a small village. It was filled with innovators, right? You just didn't think to label them innovators. We've talked about my uncle who uses molasses in his cement to increase the tensile strength of the cement, right? Is that like a thing that you do, that you know about? So I think everywhere we have innovators. What we've done in the US is sort of formalized them, and a very particular subset of our society we've elevated and we worship, right? That's what I'd say to you. So the idea of innovation, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Right?
Are you an innovator?
I struggle with that. I think that in terms of the way that we look at the world, like we think of Musk and Gates and these guys that we worship, and I'm not that guy, but certainly I can solve a problem and provide a distinct or unique approach to it. So yeah, maybe I am.
I took a minute for you, and I think what's interesting about who you immediately went to as kind of the narrative of who an innovator is are white guys, old white men.
Exactly.
Not that we don't love old white men, but none of us are old white men sitting right here. And so I guess where I want to go with this question is this idea around who we see and how that might influence how we create our own innovation identity, or how we could actually see ourselves as innovators. And so what I want to understand from you, Riyaad, is, has there been a person in your life, family aside, who has represented your experience such that you felt like you could be them? Like an innovative person or someone that was doing things different, where you said, you've inspired me perhaps to think that I can do so.
So when I was 22, I just left I was consulting. I was fortunate enough to be consulting for a group that did work with NASA. And I joined this startup. And the startup was run by this guy. His name is Z. He's like 6 foot tall, Bosnian. And this other gentleman, David Hendrickson, Zia Ganovic and David Hendrickson. And these two guys ran this company, this software company, out of Sunrise. And I started on as the guy that would go get sandwiches, right? Like that was my role. Mind you, I'd done other things, but they put me in that role. They were a startup company that ultimately got acquired by Microsoft a couple of years later. And I went from like the bottom of the totem pole to pretty much a top. I had my own department or whatever, that sort of thing. And what I learned there was this is what I wanted to do. Every day was different. Every problem was different. You had to learn a million things to solve any given problem at any given point. And you were only as good as the weakest person on your team. Mm-hmm. And I think what I enjoyed, what I learned there was, this is what I want to do. And that narrative, if you think about it, has been like all the startups I've been a part of, all the teams all the companies we've sold, it's been me wanting to recreate that joy that we got, that sense of, I don't know how else to put it. It's not joie de vivre, but you're alive. You're fighting, right? You're sort of in your element. It's the closest thing I think if you were hunting an animal like 10,000 years ago, that's the feeling that you'd get. Honestly, that's what I strive to recreate, right? That alignment, that joy, that, oh yeah, we're about to do this thing. That's what I'd say.
I think, and I'm going to pass the question on to you as well, thinking about an experience, a person that represented kind of that roadmap to being an innovator, to the extent you had one, or if you didn't, what that impact had. But also what you said, I think is important, Riyaad, is there is an element of empowerment that comes from innovating and also identifying as an innovator. And I know we're going to get into a bunch of topics today, but a lot of what I talk about in the book is we sometimes don't see how important empowerment is and what goes in to create that empowerment. And it's not just doing a thing. It is often the environmental circumstances, or as my mother would say, the material conditions, right, of your life that influence that. But I guess the question to you, Sherrell, is what person inspired you to think innovatively or be an innovator?
You know, as we were sitting here, I was trying to think of all of these people that I've kind of followed externally. My core family, like I'm the only entrepreneur. I'm the only crazy person that made these very alternative decisions and choices in life. Like going away to college was like not a thing that you did. And so I was thinking about these folks that I've had to follow, like the Oprahs of the world and the Arianna Huffington. And, you know, I grew up in Seattle, so I was definitely a Microsoft kid, and, you know, the Bill Gates. And so being somewhat disconnected, but when I think about what gave me the confidence to make the choices that I made, it is Monica McAfee in her hair salon on Rainier and Seward Park in Seattle. And she had a computer science background, worked in tech for a bit, and became disenchanted with the industry, being a Black woman, being in spaces that weren't necessarily the most welcoming, but also desiring a sense of freedom and an opportunity to serve her community. And so converted the mother-in-law unit of her home into a salon, and has served women, church folks, these people who've been her clients for 20, 30 years, you know, that no matter what has happened in the economy or what have you, her clients were always faithful. And I remember working at the salon, sweeping hair, helping to schedule appointments, the things that were so minute that helped me even today to think about what does customer service look like? What does building, loyal clients look like? Fostering relationships. I learned that in Monica's hair salon. And when I think about the job opportunities that she gave us, and I think about having an internship at a Microsoft in high school, and realizing how fortunate I was to grab something that was traditionally reserved for the city's elite schools that I was not a part of. I think about the small business entrepreneurs in communities that look like mine, who were the first ones to give us our first jobs and to teach us business, even on a small level, to teach us that you can create your own path and design that, even if it seems contrary to the easy road that could have definitely defined, you know, your life and your career. And of course, being in a tech city, it couldn't have been easy to navigate that space. But I always look back to that experience of seeing a Black woman running her own business, deciding her own hours, and deciding also to bring in other folks who normally wouldn't have had an opportunity to have a part-time job, you know, learn the same kind of lessons that I learned. And so I loved this question because I always had this philosophy that, well, if we create internship programs in communities of color and communities that we call marginalized, but put it into the hands of small businesses to hire interns during the summer, like that could be much more influential than that 1 in 20 chance to get an internship with a startup, right? That not everyone's going to have access to, but I might be able to hop on the bus and go to the salon or go to the distribution center and learn the skills I need for life.
In the book, I talk about that in terms of inspiration capital, right? It's this idea that we really need people that reflect us. And it doesn't always have to be people that look like you. It helps when they do though. But it's people who can reflect almost a vision forward of what your life could be. And I think even exposure to that provides you with almost a clarity of a roadmap. Because it's very hard to be what you cannot see, right? It's very hard to envision something you've never been exposed to. But once you get that little tiny bit of exposure, then it really opens up so much more opportunities. But what I love what both of you kind of touched on, and I want to talk a little bit about, what is the environment that allows one to create? A lot of times when we think about innovation, it's normally in terms of the output, like the thing that has happened, or an innovator in terms of what they've been able to accomplish. But not often do we think about what they personally had to unblock or what they personally had to overcome to actually be empowered to create something. Because you can actually be creative, and we've talked a lot about creativity, and there's this idea of flow, but there are also real mental, physical, environmental, cultural roadblocks that sometimes prevent us from believing in ourselves enough to do that. So I guess my question, I'll start with you, Sherrell, is what are some of the blocks? What were some of the barriers, whether systemic, structural, or personal or familial, that you had to overcome to become entrepreneurial, innovative, and create your thing?
Yeah, I think that definitely, as I mentioned before, I didn't come from an entrepreneurial family. So while there's applause, there's not an understanding of what support looks like, right? I think that there's a difference between saying oh, that's, you've done a great job, or congrats, right? And versus saying, I'm going to invest if you have resources to invest. And so I think that's kind of rough when you are early on exploring and trying to navigate and really just having to use the materials at hand, whether it, I remember getting the subscription to Black Enterprise. My cousins come home from college, right? And they were all computer science majors at Spelman and Clark and Morehouse, and they got me a subscription to Black Enterprise magazine. And it was the first time I learned that word entrepreneur. And I remember there was a cover of Mary Pugh, who was a hedge fund manager, or it still is a hedge fund manager. And I used to babysit her daughter. And I was I have no idea what this is or what you do, but you're on the cover of this. And I just remember being just so enthralled with there's someone doing this thing and I have no idea how to get there. And so I'm going to have to consume materials and chart this path by asking lots of annoying questions and following people and just trying to figure out how to get myself into spaces. I don't know that I always did that effectively or efficiently, but I knew that I had to create circumstances where I was around people who thought differently and saw possibility. And, hence deciding to leave Seattle and go to school in New York. Mm-hmm. And I had to pay a price for that because I didn't get as much scholarship money as I got if I would have stayed home, right? But I also knew that if I stayed home, I wouldn't have been able to stretch the way that I wanted to. And now at 17, 18, you're making these choices with such little life experience, but knowing that there's something calling you to stretch. And so I think that guidance part was something that I craved, but didn't necessarily know how to get around and ask for from a network perspective. I think also growing up in the Northwest, as you know, is a bubble.
Yes.
It is a very distinctive bubble because you're raised in this very multicultural environment. If you have parents that, have any kind of professional careers, that puts you in a different kind of lane, right? And so my entire world was shaped around this very multicultural, liberal experience. And so leaving home was such a drastic culture shock because the way that I saw myself was vastly different than I noticed that the world saw me. And I would say I didn't really know how Black I was until I got into rooms where people were I could feel the change and the difference. or that changed the difference of showing up and being female and being all of these things. And I knew that, like, I knew who I was, but now realizing that I'm going to be in spaces, whether it was in the North or the South or any other country that I was going to, that people will perceive you a certain kind of way. And then I felt like I was building my accolades to prove that I belong in this room, I deserve to be in this room. And like, you can look at my face, but also like check my LinkedIn
resume,
check my resume, right? And then I felt like my sense of credibility had to trump that I showed up as female and as Black. And I mean, to this day, like even just saying that, I feel a bit embarrassed that that's the way that I thought. But I saw, in order to navigate and to move beyond survival and to navigate these spaces, those things mattered to people. Because I saw people relax when I said I was from Seattle.
Oh, yeah.
And I wasn't from Brooklyn, right? Or I wasn't from Atlanta, you know, and like no shade, but there's something different. People relate to you very differently when they feel like, oh, you're from like this city that I know that is very like this, right? And they don't automatically assume that you've had a certain experience. So those barriers and roadblocks are interesting things because you have to really stand in who you are as you're trying to figure out who that is, and representing yourself in a way that dignifies yourself, your community, those who are never in the room that look like you, and trying to also create space, but also not trying to allow that to dictate the narrative and the story as you're shaping it. And that's an art and a science in and of itself. And I will say, you know, I've decided to build things on my own because I was tired of the shifting. Dr. Melissa Harris Perry, in her book, Sister Citizen, refers to this whole theory as sitting in a straight room in a crooked chair and constantly having to adjust. And I think that after working in tech for so many years and being in spaces where I just felt like I'm tired of adjusting, so let me build a company where I don't have to adjust. Let me do work and live my life so that I do not have to adjust. And that in itself has been a journey through roadblocks, through barriers, through navigating a world that sees me in the way that it sees me, but me taking on the onus and saying, this is how I see myself, and now I want to go build things that give space for people to not feel like they have to shift around in their chairs.
Yeah, I love that. It's funny, I had a similar experience, the culture shock of leaving the Northwest. Like, I didn't know what it meant to be Black.
Yeah.
And added piece from Canada, so that's a whole nother ball game. And when I went to an HBCU, I really had no understanding of what it meant to be Black in the rest of America, and what that meant in terms of access to opportunities, what that meant in terms of how people perceived you, what that meant in terms of like all of this cultural baggage that it's not to say that doesn't exist in the Northwest, but like it's not, I don't think it's as present in your everyday life. So Riyaad, same question to you. You know, what are the roadblocks, both personal, like mindset personally, and internally and externally, that you had to overcome?
I think it's different for immigrants, right? I came here when I was like 13, and my parents uprooted their lives in their early 40s and decided, oh, we're just gonna, for whatever reason, it wasn't particularly safe where we lived, they decided that they wanted to come here. I never quite fit in. The community, the school that I went to, the high school I ended up going to, I was like one of 3 Indian people in the entire school. So the idea of like a cultural identity is just, you know, not a thing. What I'd say to you is this: being a first generation immigrant, risk aversity, right? So my parents were not like, hey, do whatever you'd like. No. You need to go to school and you need to figure out how to get a degree, and then you need to go to medical school, and then you need to become a doctor. This is what, this is what we do, okay? There was that pressure. Mind you, my grandmother, for example, couldn't read, couldn't write. So they were determined to make something, all this risk, all this sort of pain and sort of adjustment, this was going to be worth something. And as the oldest, I felt pressure to sort of be that guy, right? And I was the least, I had no desire to get it took me a long time to get my degree. I had no desire to join the workforce and be, another cog in the wheel, right? So two things sort of defined how I looked at life early. One was my willingness to take risk. Like in the middle of the dot-com boom, I had like 16 computers in the front room of my house. I was running like an agency, like a technology agency, right? Like everybody's doing their thing, I'm doing my thing, right? The contraction in business happened and I had to switch gears, but like this is what I was going to do, right? My mom was like, why is the electric bill this high? You're paying it well, right? So that happened. So what I learned was I needed to be okay with taking risks, and I failed. I mean, when I tell you I failed, I counted once. I've worked or been involved in 30 different startups, right? Wow. Worked for 30 different people, failed 7 different startups that failed. So risk averseness is one thing. And then the other thing is sort of the opposite or mirror of that is autonomy, right? For me, the moments I've shined is when someone says, go solve that problem and do whatever you need to do to solve that problem, right? I was able to close like a $10 million deal for our company because someone just said, you know who's perfect for that problem? Riyaad.
Yeah.
And then take whatever you need to go do and go solve that problem. So it's not a carrot and stick, because only recently has my mother begun to appreciate, like, this was the right path for you, because I've been fortunate enough to have some successes. But prior to that, brown sheep, black sheep, however you want to think about it.
That was you.
That was me.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Be like your brothers. Right?
Yeah.
So that adversity, I think, risk and autonomy, those are the two sort of touch points for me.
I'm an innovator, but if I'm being honest with you, I couldn't always call myself an innovator. I've spent the better part of a decade launching and leading projects designed to help everyday people access their innovation potential. It's included projects that have unlocked over $75 million for things that bridge gaps in access, opportunity, and equity. When I transitioned from being a trial attorney to leading organizations in the innovation space, what I really needed was a guide to help me answer 2 critical questions. Am I an innovator? And what type of innovator am I? The problem is that our society and our own identity serve as barriers to keep our powerful potential as innovators locked away and hidden. Innovation Currency is the book that is designed to help you discover your hidden innovator. If you've ever wondered what innovation looks like for you, how you might use innovation in your day-to-day life, or how you can use innovation to help solve some of the most pressing challenges in the world, or even your workplace or community, then please grab your copy of Innovation Currency, because I can assure you that after reading it, you'll have the tools, the experience, and the translatable skills to unlock your hidden innovator. To find out where you can purchase your copy in whatever format makes sense for you, scroll down to the show notes for the appropriate links.
So we talked a little bit about the internal and external kind of roadblocks, mountains that you had to overcome. I want to switch gears to a little bit of my favorite fun topic, which is, I personally think that a lot of where like the root of our personal innovation, the root of our innovation identity is found in understanding who we are. You know the famous quote, the 2 most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why. And, from a spiritual standpoint, we talk a lot in the church about like where your identity comes from. Clarity of purpose helps to give you clarity of direction and really like maximizing the reason why you're here. And so that always gets me thinking about like, what is your superpower, right? Like everybody has a unique subset of superpowers, and not superpowers for external validation, but superpowers that allow for you to know that when I'm doing this thing, I am in my most innovative zone, like zone of genius. It's where I can probably see myself the most innovatively. And for me, I'll share like my 3 are communication, no surprise, strategy, and connection, like connecting, relationship building, connecting concepts. So I guess the question that I have for you both, and I'll start with you, Sherrell, is like, what are your superpowers? What are your top 3?
Yeah, gosh. He asked these like very thoughtful questions, and I'm like, I wish I would have been prepared. But no, good. Off the cuff is great because I don't even know what I'm gonna say. So when I think about the way that I've navigated my life and my work, one of my superpowers is being able to navigate connecting the dots around what is emerging. And I think becoming a journalist was so funny because I never thought that this is the space I would be in. But it was like, no matter what city I lived in about 7 different cities in the US, I've always been able to find not just the entrepreneurial community, but being able to tell stories about some of the most unique and sort of underexamined parts of those communities. And I love bringing those to the surface and making people think differently about ideas or think differently about where they live. Maybe the second thing is a sense of adventure and allowing people to feel free to have adventure, to not feel rigid. And I think that I kind of gave that to myself, and being able to take risks and move and start over and sell furniture on Craigslist and, and figure out life. And I try to give that to people who are starting their journey as entrepreneurs, or start whatever is new for them. A sense of, at the end of the day, if you don't do this, you're going to regret it. So try it, because you can always go back to whatever it is you were doing before. But if you don't do it, you're going to regret it.
Yeah.
So that freedom to be free to an extent. And what is the third thing? Like, this is really tough. Oh my gosh. You may have to come back to me, because you're going to come up with some
No. We got to stay here for a moment. There's at least one more. You can phone a friend if you want.
I would love to. I would love to phone a friend.
I'll be your friend.
Yeah. I think just to figure shit out.
Yeah.
I think that that is such a superpower. It's like, and I remember my mom had this conversation when I was 10. She's like, I hate that I raised you with so much confidence because no one can tell you anything. She's like, no one can tell you anything. It's like, tell me no. And I'm like, I'm going to figure it out. Right. From, figuring out how to hustle and, make extra money when I wanted more pairs of tap shoes. And so I was taking so many classes, and my mom's like, this is outside the family budget. You're going to have to figure it out. Right. It was always figure shit out. And I think that every milestone that I've had, whether it was a rough road to get there, I always figured it out. And I love that saying of everything is figure outable. And sometimes even when you're in a very, very tough, even learning curve, especially in business, it's take a breath, take a pause, and think about all the resources around you, all the people that you can connect with or call, the lifeline, as you mentioned, to help you walk through this. This is not above you. This is not something that is you're not going to just stop right here, right? And so I think that's my superpower, is being able to figure shit out.
Riyaad,
Wow.
What are your 3 superpowers?
3 superpowers.
He had time. It's going to be...
And he's had more time, because we have talked about this over and over and over again, over coffee and chai.
Well, it's something we think about, right, as professionals. We want to know what we do well. So I'd say this to you. The trajectory in my life has led to many things that sort of have challenged me personally, required growth. And for a long time after those things, what I wanted to do was sort of be very good, right? Be very good as a human being. Not so much as a professional, but sort of well-rounded in multi-dimensions, right? So I'd say to you, actualization is really a thing for me. I oscillate, but the idea, I think, Maslow, Chessman, whoever you want to talk about, that idea of being in the zone. So I would do weird things, right? You'd walk by CIC, you'd see me standing on a table looking at user interfaces, and people would be like, why is that guy standing on the table looking at his user interfaces? To think of, I'm using some techniques I learned to change my perspective, right? So what I tried to do was learn how to be good at the thing. So actualization is one thing I'd say that I definitely worked on. The other thing is I'm very fortunate. I have the ability to kind of remember and recall information.
Everything.
So what that means is I can take a mental model from one domain and translate it to another domain. That's a very useful skill. The ability to take something, for example, why does PCR work, and figure out some facet of that and apply it to some other model, maybe in marketing or whatever. That's such an underrated skill. It's a cross-functionality, right? And I think that's really where we're at right now, where there's too much specialization. If you buy into Putin and some of these other guys, you kind of, we don't know enough about the world, and being able to know a little more is sort of really, really cool, right? It affords so many opportunities to solve problems. So cross-disciplinary actualization. And then the other thing I'd say to you is, when we talk about people, and when you begin to have companies and you raise money and capital, you become a leader. And you have a choice as a leader as to how you lead. And the people we venerate, so for example, Musk, I think he's a horrid leader, right? I don't agree with his style. I think they're better models, right? So I like the idea of the servant leader, and I aspire to be a leader that has empathy, that can understand, that's accessible. So those are the things I'd point to, right? So how we lead says everything about us. How we react when no one's watching, what we do, in our off time, says more about us than when we are in front of a camera or anything like that, right? So those are the three things I'd say to you, right? Actualization, cross-disciplinary functionality, and maybe leadership, right? Those things define us.
I know we're running short on time, but I want to dig into one other topic really quickly. So what I wanted to ask about before we kind of close out our conversation is relationships, right? Part of the book talks a lot about social capital. And I had this kind of realization about social capital since I've had the pleasure of leading Venture Cafe. Like in 4.5 years, 50,000 connections. We see hundreds of people every single week. And I realized that we were actually in the business of redistributing, reallocating social capital, because I was able to bring in people that the regular folks that were coming to Venture Cafe typically would not have exposure to. They would not have connection to. Some of the large, like we've brought our friends in from Delta Airlines to come down and have the head of their innovation group sitting at a table with anybody who just would show up. And so I guess it got me thinking a lot about the power of relationships, and having you two here, we've built a good relationship over the past little while. We've built a relationship over years. We've known each other for a long, long time. And so I guess my question to you both is really, what is the most important element of building deep, meaningful, authentic, professional relationships? Like, what is the secret?
And there has to be a level of consistency. I think honesty matters a great deal. Delivering well as well in any kind of relationship that you have. I mean, you're investing, you're making an investment into a person or a business, whether it's a client or a future client, what have you. There's a certain level of commitment there. And there's also the trust factor, right? You're building up this trust, this capability, just like in a relationship with anyone else, friends, family, romantic partners, what have you. And I love this part of it, because this is where I've had my greatest success, is in having relationships that have been mutually beneficial, of course, but also knowing that you have to be intentional about the way in which you build, being of service. And I love that you had brought up that servant leadership attribute. That matters a great deal, and not just leading a company, but I think also leading your reputation. People like to work with people that they like. at the end of the day. They like to do business with people that they like. That's been my experience thus far. And being able to invest in relationships from, obviously now we're not, on the ground at tech conferences, but from making that first connection to, hey, I happen to be in your city, next week, would love to take you to coffee, tell me what you're working on, tell me what excites you. Following up, I don't think it has to be an overkill situation, but finding out what people value, finding out what they're working on and ways in which you can help them, even if it's not beneficial for you directly, and being able to help make those connections. I found that has paid dividends in me getting top corporate Fortune 1000, Fortune 500 companies to be my clients. Because these companies are made up of people, right? At the end of the day, people are still people. And I think we've learned that gravely during a global pandemic, where some people are at home taking care of small kids. Some people are caring for, elderly folks. There's been tremendous amount of deaths, right? And so I think even more now, the quality and the ferventness of relationship, I think we're learning that on a different scale, and remembering that we're all still also very human. And that matters. And social capital, again, is so paramount to your ascension and the ability to move from one chapter to the next. And sometimes it's easier when you do have that lifeline that you can call to get there. So I find them to be one of the most important aspects of the work that I try to do as I'm learning from a personal and professional development standpoint and a leadership standpoint. But if my relationships aren't at the highest quality, it's going to be harder for me to push that boulder up the hill.
Yeah. Riyaad, for you, what's the secret to authentic relationships?
Well, I think authentic is an interesting word, I think. So I, like everything else, I delve into things deeply, right? So when I think about relationships, authenticity is incredibly important. So there's study after study that talks about, like, for example, Dunbar's number that says we can only hold so many relationships in our brain, or we're pre-wired for, maybe 150, 200 numbers. What I think is really interesting about some of the studies is they talk about authenticity, right? So if I say something to you, like, and it's not authentic, like, I really love your watch, you're not wearing a watch, you're going to recognize subconsciously that I just yanking your chain, right? And what's so interesting is we as humans, we code for authenticity, right? We know when someone is being congruent. We know when someone's being authentic. We know when someone's genuinely interested in what we have to say. So for me, relationship building is about finding that space. I learned a lot from this one sales guy we had. He would find something to say about everyone that was true, right? He would find something complimentary. In a world where, for example, it's hard to find balance and rapport with everyone, he could do that. And then the lesson to me is that's sort of important. You can't always build genuine relationships. You're not going to be best friends with every individual that you meet, but you certainly can do the things that allow you to find a common ground and some congruency and some authenticity. So blatantly saying something that's not true, I really admire your company when you despise it, may not be the way to go. So for me, what I've learned is authenticity is sort of like the only way to navigate relationship. If there's a road to a relationship, the thing you have to navigate carefully. There's a lot of things like rapport building that you can do, but if you have authentic relationship, I think that's critical. And and congruency, right? Yeah. There's an unspoken law for entrepreneurs, and what it is this: I'll help you and you'll help me, and that's the code. Like, in The Mandalorian, there's that code. This is the code. This is the way. And people that don't follow that code, they're on the periphery, and they wonder, why are things not working for me, right? Because I put the self first, not the code or the cohesive unit.
Yeah. In the book, I talk a lot about this equation for social capital, and I don't know if it's right, but it's my observations, and I think I've shared this with you, around real relationships. And I made the switch probably about 2 years ago from being not transactional but strategic, because that's just naturally how my brain works, to being very intentional about cultivating relationships. And from that, I realized that social capital is really a function of trust in shared values, having this mutuality of trust that we share the same values, because then the playing field is the same level. Like, we both know that we value inclusion or equity or vulnerability. And another piece is something that you spoke to, which is cultivated intimacy. It's not just cultivated action or, meetings. It is cultivated intimacy where over time you're doing things that show more of yourself, getting to know, for example, I know you tap dance. I know that you're from the Northwest. Like, with Riyaad, you know a lot about me, and that has nothing to do with our jobs, nothing to do with probably the reason why we first met, other than just hanging out at CIC. And so I think that the relationship building, when done intentionally, is really a function of those things. I want to end on one quick question, a rapid fire question, which is, why does the world need innovators? I'll start with you, Riyaad, and then I'll go end on you. Why does the world need innovators?
So, depending on how you want to think of the world, 6 billion, 10 billion, 100,000 years ago, Homo erectus emerged. Somebody had to figure out how to start a fire, right? The guy that figured out how to start the fire is the reason that we needed innovation, right? He figured out how to start a fire, changed the trajectory of our world, right? We can point back to that moment and go, what did everybody else do before that? Right? Same for the wheel, same for crops, those people. So what's happened is the world has become more complex, but we still have those fundamental problems that transcend who we are as a species, right? So literally the way our brains were wired, the way we changed genetically because somebody figured that out, right? Mm-hmm. That's the simplest answer, right? We evolved because of people willing to take risks.
I love that. Sherrell.
I love that. I think that's a great response. That definitely would have been something similar that I would have answered in terms of innovation for evolution. Mm-hmm. But I think about the fact that we have not reached equality across the world yet. And innovation is required to continue challenging what we thought were the norms that have historically oppressed people and left people without. Around the world, from a poverty standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from a gender standpoint, pay inequality, all of these kinds of things. We need innovation to continue to challenge the status quo.
I love that. I think we need innovators because the world has real big challenges, as you both have alluded to. And I always say innovation is really about how to solve some of the most pressing issues that impact the human condition. Not the Black condition, not the white condition, not whatever color you are or gender, but we as human beings, those fundamental problems that affect us all. We need people that are thinking differently and bringing different solutions. So with that, Riyaad, Sherrell, thank you for joining me for this conversation. It was truly a pleasure.